This is episode 100 of the Death to Tyrants podcast.
The crushing weight of the tyrant's passage had left nothing unmarked.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Death to Tyrants podcast. As always, I am your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you out of Austin, Texas, with episode 100. Thank you guys for all of the support and the emails, the t-shirt orders. I'm humbled that you guys support me like that. So thank you very much, and I look forward to many, many more episodes. Well, we're living through this coronavirus crazy moment. Obviously, I can't go celebrate my 100th episode at a restaurant or bar, right? What I could do is invite my favorite thinker and speaker in the liberty movement today onto the show to chat about this stuff, and that's exactly what I did. I've got Jeff Deist here today on the show. He is the president of the Mises Institute. He's back on the show, I should say. You guys remember him from before, and I know you know the Mises Institute. I said it before many times, and I honestly mean this. It is the greatest organization on the planet. So I've been doing several episodes surrounding this mess that we're living through right now, getting different takes and perspectives. And when you're doing that, you got to get Jeff Deist on. He always has a really cool take and perspective on things, and that's just what I did. We're going to get into national rule versus local rule. We love talking. Jeff is so good on the topic of decentralization and secession and whatnot. I love talking about this stuff. Like, there's no reason. You got these guys calling for nationwide shutdowns. Ironically, a lot of them are from the left, and they're asking Trump to shut the country down. Go figure. Well, is that really the best way to handle things? Do the people in New York, where it's really a dense population, high density area, do they need the same methods of fixing this stuff as the people in Wyoming or South Dakota? Think about that. And when you hear someone say that Trump needs to fix this at the national level, you got to start to question people like that. They're the same people, I think, that are telling me all day yesterday and today that I've got to vote for Joe Biden no matter what. A lot of those people don't think through, and they don't hold core principles that they can apply to each subject. They just kind of wander all over which way the wind blows. And so beware of those kind of voices. And one of the things we talk about, society, there's this bubbling up of everything is so politicized, but there's been we've had an embarrassment of riches, let's face it. And so there's been this nice Band-Aid over things. And when moments like this happen, it kind of rips off the Band-Aid. And you've got people yelling in your face, stay at home, stay away from me. And it's like, wow, you see how heavily politicized things really are. And you see how people act in a moment of seriousness. It kind of shows their true colors. We get into that stuff today too. I shouldn't waste your time too much longer. I'm excited to have Jeff here. Let me tell you about him real quick. Jeff Deist is the president of the Mises Institute, where he serves as a writer, public speaker, and advocate for property, markets, and civil society. He previously worked as a longtime advisor and chief of staff to Congressman Ron Paul, for whom he wrote hundreds of articles and speeches. In his years with Dr. Paul, he worked with countless grassroots activists and organizations dedicated to reducing the size and scope of government. I'm so stoked to have him here on my 100th episode of Death to Tyrants. Jeff Deist, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good myself. How are things there in Auburn? There was a point where I read that Alabama had not locked down as tight as other states. Are y'all under similar rules as we are in Texas, with kind of the essential businesses allowed to be open?
Yes, I think we have the same sort of order or directive put in place by our governor, in the sense that so-called non-essential businesses people are supposed to stay home, and you're allowed to go out and about for groceries and that sort of thing. Now, it's interesting that our governor was a little better than some for a while. She held fast but crumbled when Florida and Georgia, our neighboring states, went under lockdown or martial law or whatever kind of soft pedaling term we want to come up with for it. But what strikes me is that it really comes down to what the cops do about it. Wherever you live, anywhere in the United States, the degree to which you were locked down or prohibited from going out and about or whatever is really a matter for on-the-spot enforcement at the whims of the cop who happens to be in your area, right? I mean, if you, and so that's what's so interesting about all this is that we really need some Irish democracy here. People could just ignore this stuff. Where I happen to live is a bucolic college town, about 75,000 people. And I think there's maybe 15-ish full-time local police officers, maybe a few others who are part-time. So that's, 20 people, 25 people. And it's really, it's kind of surreal here because college didn't come back from spring break. So normally Auburn is full of young people and students everywhere. And there's a lot of sports going on. It's a big SEC school. And so, and it's getting to be warm spring weather. So normally this would be a very lively time in Auburn. And the Mises Institute happens to be located right across the street from the big stadium and a big nexus for the campus. So that part is surreal. But you look at a place like Austin, you look at a place like Auburn, and what could they really do if everyone just said, okay, that's enough. We're all going back to work. And I think on May 1st, I think the country absolutely has to engage in civil disobedience. That's less than a month away now. Until then, people are going to, do what they do. But I don't think this can go on much longer. I think the economic damage that this is bringing, but that it's going to bring is wildly beyond the scale and scope of this dopey virus. And it's pretty frightening, but I'm curious in seeing how complicit Americans are and for how long. That's an interesting social experiment and one we hadn't expected, but here we are. So, right now, it feels depressing because you've got the snitch types and the neighborhood watch groups and the Karens out there patrolling everyone's activity, but you just wonder how long that will last. And it's also, there's a class element here. It's awfully easy for suburban folks to say, stay home, you're endangering lives. But, what about poorer folks? What about folks in urban areas? What about folks in high-rise apartments? What about people who have 5 or 7 or 8 people, family members or otherwise, in a small apartment, in a tenement, in a less affluent part of New York City or Detroit or Chicago, let's say? And they're only, they have to go up and down an elevator just to go outside. And outside just means miles of concrete all around them. And maybe a walk down to a very shabby local convenience store or something as opposed to a big suburban grocery store with all kinds of stuff. It's very different to tell them that they need to self-quarantine than it is to tell some guy in the suburbs in a big house who can drive his car to a well-stocked grocery store. It's two different things. So I noticed Peter Hitchens was talking about this in the UK, that they're not going to be able to just keep certain parts of London locked down much longer. As the days get longer, the weather warms up. This is going to be an interesting experiment. And let's hope that America can show a little backbone.
Yeah, no doubt about it. One of the things you wrote that caught my eye recently within an article was this line: the coronavirus truly laid bare the deep and intolerable political divisions wracking our country. Has this been another moment in time, like the Trump election seemed that way right after it, where the intolerance of the tolerant people has been exposed?
Yes, and it feels different than 9/11 did. After 9/11, there was a sense that the country, for what it's worth, was pulling for New York City and was cheering for New York City and New York City was our beloved financial capital, and there wasn't as much of the urban, rural, red state, blue state angst, at least for a while, following 9/11. And of course, after 9/11, you could go out and do entrepreneurial things, even though travel and the economy were harmed by it. you could immediately go out and open your restaurant and try to do things. Whereas now you can't do anything other than sit at home and seethe, especially on social media, which isn't very healthy. And so I think that it's striking how this hasn't brought Americans together or made anybody in the anti-Trump world softer towards Trump or Trump voters or vice versa. There's already red state and blue state elements to it because, as we would imagine, a virus is going to cluster differently in dense areas like New York City and than it is in the middle of Wyoming, where, as far as I could see, they should just be completely having normal lives. There's been 0 deaths to date in Wyoming. So, it's exacerbating these things. It's making the election, now we're pushing primaries back. We're talking about voting by mail because we can't seem to get it together for electronic voting at home. And this is going, it's a perfect storm. Right when you've got the country this divided, first of all, you hold a national election to guarantee you have a whole year of this, shit show. And then you throw this virus on top of it. And it's just too much. It's too much. And the reason it's too much is because we've let the political world grow so big and it's the master of us. Yeah,
exactly. It's politics downstream from culture. And Paul, I think it was Paul Gottfried that said, no, culture now seems like it's downstream from politics because the whole culture seems like it's become politicized. And I don't know, I almost think that's the goal of some factions in society. An interesting aspect of this, basically what you're saying, New York City versus, say, Wyoming, I think a lot of us would say, right, so New York, you do your thing. Wyoming, you do your thing. South Dakota, you do your thing. But there's a lot of statist types that aren't okay with that. It's almost like there's a certain segment of the population whose mindset is, you have to do it the way we say. Do you see that as well?
Oh, yeah. It's across the board. This maniacal need to centralize politics and political decision-making. It's really the story of the 20th century. Things that were decided at the local or regional or state level increasingly became decided at the national level. And then ultimately, some things became decided at the supranational level. When you look at things like the EU and the United Nations and the World Health Organization. So that's been the trend. Fortunately, virtually every other aspect of human life is going the other way. It's becoming more and more decentralized. How we get knowledge, banking, distribution systems, warehouse systems, delivery systems. So as the rest of the world goes the other way, only government digs in its heels and centralizes. And I think it is a real problem. And especially in a case like this, where you don't need a one-size-fits-all policy. You don't need a top-down policy. And what we'd like to see is states trying different things and different approaches, that we'd have better data about what might work and what doesn't. I understand that a virus doesn't care about a national or a state border. We all get that. But how you approach it might vary quite differently. Talking about South Dakota and Kristi Noem the other day, they have something like 11 people per square mile. They are something like the 5th least dense state in the union. Okay, well, that probably means that they're mostly okay, and that whatever they produce in South Dakota, whether that's shale or ag or whatever it is, they ought to be out there doing it. There's no reason that the whole country can't, has to be doing the same thing. And maybe New York City does need to be largely locked down, or people really do need to be distancing because of the virality of this virus. I don't know. I'm not going to get into the medicine of it, but I will say this: is there's lots of trade-offs involved in where you live. This is just part of life. I mean, if you want to live in New York City, you have all this incredible job opportunities, all this incredible culture, and these restaurants and theater, and museums, and just all music, entertainment, all kinds of things. The trade-offs are it's hellaciously expensive to have an apartment. There's a lot of traffic, there's a lot of noise, there's more crime, and then some people choose to live in sparsely populated South Dakota and not have all those benefits, but they have a cheap house, or they have more quiet, or they have more peace, or whatever they value. Okay, that's fine. So why is that not apply to a pandemic? I mean, if you want to live in close quarters with millions of people on an island, you might have different health outcomes. You might have different hospital waits. You might have different degrees of crowding to get surgery. That's just, or waits, or whatever it is. I think that's just something that we ought to accept. And of course, what we see now so clearly is that one national government trying to boss around 330 million people in a country this geographically diverse, this economically diverse. I mean, it's just totally untenable. And these elections, these national elections, aren't helping. They're hurting. People are seeing it. And that's why you're seeing, I think, people on both sides now speak more openly about secession, about nullification, about sanctuary cities. The left and the right tend to use different nomenclature. But I just recall Governor Gavin Newsom of California recently referring to California as a nation state.
Yes.
And saying we're going to export things. So very, very interesting, and I think hopeful time, because as liberty-minded people, we got to get over this idea that we're going to convince 60 or 80 or 100 million people or whatever to vote a certain way. We're just not. I mean, whether a collectivist or socialist viewpoint is nature or nurture, I do not know. I do know it's stubborn, and it's not going away anytime soon. And we ought to be, I think, talking less and less about trying to persuade mass amounts of people, and more about how we might break up.
One of the things I've noticed during, I guess, bizarre moments like this, I saw some of it after the Trump election. You've got friends, or I do at least have friends in my life where I think that person kind of leans to have an authoritarian mindset. They say things that I kind of pick up on here and there that are slightly bothersome. And then something like this moment happens. And I saw one of these friends saying, it's time to have drones flying over the streets here in Austin to make sure that people aren't leaving their house. And another one said, if I were a gun guy, which of course I'm not, what I would do is drive around pointing my gun at people that are leaving their houses and yell, "Get back inside." Yeah. Is it moments like this that really bring that out in people? Do you think that human nature has these tendencies just kind of sitting within itself, and then a panic moment happens, and then you see people's true colors?
Well, that's a hell of a thing for that guy to say. I mean, yeah, I think it is latent in most of us. And I mean, we're still sitting here with food and hot and cold running water and electricity and air conditioning and all kinds of material comforts. Imagine we didn't have those. Imagine what the Karens become if they didn't have that. I mean, America, it doesn't have some sort of magic soil where the people who live here are just imbued with a greater sense of freedom or distrust of government. That's clearly not the case. And no offense, but it's clearly not the case in Austin.
Right. No, yeah.
So, drones are in use. They're in use in London. They're in use in New York City. They're talking to people. They're hovering over and saying, break up, you're too close together, that sort of thing. And so all of us have a cell phone, which is a tracking device that we've accepted. And cars today, especially cars built after about 2016, 2017, are essentially tracking devices as well. So these are the trade-offs of a modern society: convenience for lack of privacy. And the drone thing, I think, again, we'll see where it goes. I'd like to see Americans show a little backbone. It would be a shame if some of those things just by accident managed to get shot out of the sky. That would be a terrible, terrible thing. And, I saw Caitlin Johnstone, who's a blogger some of your listeners might know, who blogs from Australia. And I follow her, and I'm sort of keenly aware of what she writes. And she made a joke the other day about some sort of Aussie slingshot that is going to come back in vogue as the cops start using drones everywhere. And I thought to myself, well, that's, I hope you've enjoyed the spoils of being an anti-gun leftist all these years.
Yeah, right.
Because you're reduced to slingshots to deal with the cops in Australia.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's funny, sometimes people on the far left that we actually have some things in common with, they don't quite see just a few of those inconsistencies, like that, for instance.
Right. And of course, I like her. I don't know her, but I like her. And there's no reason that our worldviews can't coexist other than under some sort of universalist or centralized mindset. There's no reason that she can't have a community that's more in keeping with her perspectives, and I can't have one that's more in keeping with mine. But what's preventing us from doing all that, of course, is politics and political organization of society.
Yeah, no doubt. You touched upon a while ago the governor of South Dakota. In one of your articles, you kind of, with a broad brush, painted just a few ideas that states could do during this time that kind of separates them from the national scene. Could you discuss a couple of those that you mentioned in that article?
Well, first, I'd like to see a governor just say that with respect to the federal Constitution, any sort of lockdown or quarantine or business shutdown requires due process. And due process would require some sort of hearing or court session, at least at the administrative level, and it would require some immediate or direct showing of harm by a specific individual. You're infected, and therefore you can't go here because it can't just be this broad, vague thing. So due process has not been followed, and to be fair, and to my shock, the Trump administration has not implemented a national shutdown, even with respect to the airlines. Mm-hmm. They've issued guidelines. That's a little different. So first and foremost, I'd like to see a governor step up and say, the federal government has no authority to shut anybody in our state down, first and foremost. And then beyond that, start talking about how they could be open. And I think if a state wanted to be a little more entrepreneurial here, and we don't know how long these deaths are going to continue and to last, but if a state wanted to be a little entrepreneurial, they might actually attract some capital and some investment in their state. Say, look, we're going to be open for business, and we're going to be open for business right now. And here's how it's going to look. And then issue some strong guidelines for older people, for nursing homes, that sort of thing. Otherwise just say, we have less population. Here's what we're going to do with masks. I like the idea of using the state bar associations to get people together to figure out what to do about rent, because I'm sure on April 1st, millions of people and millions of businesses around the country did not pay rent, and that'll probably happen again on May 1st. So I think both landlords and tenants need to be realistic and get together and start negotiating that and saying, here's where I think I can get back to work, or here's when I think I can pay, or what I can pay. Landlords are investors, and they bear a risk of loss. But I think, just states saying that we're not going to have evictions, and we're not going to enforce contracts is effectively what they're saying. That sends a signal. That sends tremors out. That makes it awfully difficult to do any business, because you start to wonder, what if? What if? So I get paid rent as long as there's not a health crisis. What else? What are the other what ifs? Another 9/11? Who knows? So I'd like to see governors doing that. I'd like to see a group of governors get together and maybe form a coalition of the open and say, as a PR matter, say we're the open states, and we're not going to go along with the same processes or the same approach as other states, because we're different. We're situated differently. I think that would be really helpful. I think there's a lot states could do with bond measures. I'm not personally a fan of loaning money to governments, but there's plenty of people out there who buy all kinds of municipal and state and federal treasury bonds. And so, if a state were to issue some bonds and back them by something like real estate that the state owns, don't put taxpayers on the hook and use the bond, use the money raised for coronavirus effective measures, then that they might say, look, we've created a fund so that if people in our state happen to die from coronavirus, that they will be insured and they'll get $1 million payout or something like that. Obviously, you don't want people dying, but if they do, you want to approach this sort of like the airlines do when there's a crash, sort of like BP did during the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf. In other words, they tried to settle it without going to court. They when there's an airline crash, the airlines have insurance, which in turn has reinsurance, which in turn has reinsurance. So the risk of that is spread amongst a lot of different carriers. Also, it just so happens that the chances of commercial aircraft crashing is very, very slim. They hardly ever crash. So when they do, they generally immediately set up a payment facility for the surviving family members. And they don't worry about any showing of negligence on the airline's part or the pilot's part or anything like that. They just dispense with all that and say, look, we're going to give you money right here, right now, just out of our insurance pool. And yes, of course, the person has to sign a document that says I won't sue you in exchange for the settlement. So it is a legal settlement in that sense. But what I'm talking about is the process here where you just pay. There's a lot of creative things I think that governors could be doing, but if they don't open for business, yesterday, a week ago, right away, they are going to find themselves with bigger problems than they ever imagined, starting with unemployment, because unemployment is still handled at the state level and at the federal level. And so I'm already hearing about the situation in Florida where people can't get online. They're going out to the physical unemployment offices, which puts a bunch of people together when they're supposed to be distancing. All kinds of problems, all kinds of delays. And I'm telling you, states can't print money. They are not the federal government. They can't print money, and it's not so easy to just come up with the money from the non-existent tax coffers right now to pay a bunch of people unemployment. And there's a lot of Americans, a ton of Americans who are really close to the bone, who, a couple weeks is it. Yeah. And so I don't know how these states are going to do that other than there's going to be a federal bailout. That's what's going to happen. But in the interim, some courageous states could just be open for business and just go at this a different way.
When this stuff first was getting serious and like the shelter-in-place orders were starting to happen, I would see blue check Twitter types saying things like, aha, there are no libertarians in a pandemic all of a sudden. And things like, now you think socialism's a good thing, I bet. And my first thought was, this has kind of been one failure after another of government, of regulation, and so on down the line. Not really private industry as much on their own. And if anything, I kind of thought more liberty would have made this entire situation better. What do you say to that there are no libertarians in a pandemic crowd?
Well, they say that about everything. There are no socialists in a stock market spike. So look, there are all kinds of things that government could be preventing right now. Why can't you and I go buy azithromycin Z-Pack and hydrochloroquine, if I'm saying that correctly, over the counter? Okay, it's got some mild side effects. I guess some people with pre-existing heart conditions are supposed to be a little careful with it. It's a simple, generic $5 anti-malarial drug. And you could be taking it prophylactically right now to try to not get sick to begin with. And if that works, I don't know that it does, but there's an awful lot of anecdotal evidence to the effect that it does work. Then that would cascade out and save a lot of people from ever seeing a doctor or ever burdening a hospital or ever needing a ventilator. That's just a very obvious example. But the point is that even when there is a virus which does not respect borders, which travels quickly in a global world, which seems to call out for some centralized or governmental response. In other words, this is a dream come true for a centralizing collectivist. Look, clearly we need some sort of command and control process now because of this virus. You free market fundamentalists. But if you look at what they suggest, it all still comes from private individuals. It all still comes from doctors and nurses and pharmaceutical companies and ventilator equipment companies. I mean, if the government was in charge of all this, we're not seeing better outcomes in countries with a national health service. We're seeing worse.
Right.
Especially Italy, which is just, there's so many moving elements to this, the comorbidity, obesity, whether or not you smoke a lot, whether or not you're old. I really have been impressed with Singapore and Taiwan. I've been watching them pretty closely and what they've been doing, but they have, they've tried some really innovative things. So I don't think this makes any big point about libertarians being wrong about everything. I think it makes a point that statism made us all weak and vulnerable, with no money in the bank, with no ability to earn interest on the money you do have in the bank, on no incentive to save money. There are myriad ways that the state makes us a very high time preference society, even with respect to our diets and our physical health. So, they can say that, but if anything, I think this pandemic is going to make people less trusting of centralized governments because they're going to see just the ineptitude.
Yeah, one of the things that's shocked me, maybe it shouldn't at this point, but I've seen people, progressive people online, calling for nationalization of several different industries. Rachel Maddow is wanting the medical, not just healthcare, but medical type industries to be nationalized. And a lot of them also calling, of course, for national stay-at-home orders from Donald Trump, the guy that they said was literally Hitler before. So it just seemed there's a twist of irony in there that's the guy that they want nationalizing industries.
Yes, and I guess to an extent, we all do this. We all twist current events or happenings into a narrative that fits our worldview. It's just human nature. I mean, there's nothing Rachel Maddow's ever going to see or hear or come across that's going to change her worldview probably. And so no matter what happens, she has to comport the facts into that worldview. And as libertarians, we're not immune from this. I mean, it's easy to say, if the FDA didn't do X, Y, and Z, or if the market, if we allowed price gouging, then we could move ventilators to where they're most needed. There's lots of things we can say, but you got to understand we're falling to an extent into the same sort of confirmation bias. And, I think sometimes our answer has to be that bad things happen. There's bad things in life. And the best we can do is apply human ingenuity via markets to make them better. And that'll always be better, faster, cheaper, more efficient, and honestly more just than anything the state does. The left doesn't see it that way, but we do. And that sometimes human existence is about muddling through, and markets do that, inch by inch, groping around in the dark, seeking new information from prices and profits and loss, so far better than any bureaucrat ever can. And that's just a simple fact. And so at some point we have to think about separating ourselves and allowing these differing worldviews to not be yoked together politically anymore. I think it's the only way forward, because I think after this election in the fall, regardless of who wins, if we even hold an election, I mean, what's that going to look like if we're still shut down? You're going to have a lot of very unhappy people in this country, no matter how it turns out. And that just shows you that politics isn't working. Democracy isn't working. It doesn't create some compromise down the middle where neither side gets everything it wants, but they get some of it. It's just creating an entrenched class of unaccountable people. And that's what we're up against. And so that, Rachel Maddow would just swap out that entrenched class with some people she likes better. That's the difference between her and us.
Right. Are there any silver linings that you've seen that could come of this mess?
Wow. Not a lot. I think crises generally ramp up governments, ratchet things up. And as we all know, the ratchet is one way.
Right.
So that's a little scary. But if it's moving us closer towards secession or some sort of political breakdown, that there could be something good there. I'm not an accelerationist. I don't like this idea like, well, we just have to watch the world burn, and we want the Fed to collapse the dollar, and we want Social Security and Medicare payments to run out. And I don't come at things that way because so many people would just be grievously harmed, especially in the short term. So, that's not something I want to advocate. I think it's going to get people thinking more about the Fed again, which they haven't thought much about since '08. So there's some potential here for education, that sort of thing. I think it's going to make a lot of people move more into physical cash and into gold and into Bitcoin. And that's probably a good thing. But, we can only save who we can save. And I think we have to be cognizant of that and not bite off more than we can chew. And, whether that's going to be a vanguard of people who understand that the only way the U.S. economy or any other economy on earth is going to get back to any sort of real normal productivity is with some kind of sound money and not what's going on with central banks, then that's how it is. There's just a vanguard. And it's always been that way in society. There's always been sort of generalized amnesia or generalized ignorance or whatever it is. And there's lots of people out there who undoubtedly think we're ignorant of X, Y, and Z. So, I'd like to see silver linings. I'd like to see federalism and subsidiarity and even secession gain ground. But I don't think that, I'm not Paul Krugman. This isn't the broken window fallacy. I don't think that a virus coming along and wiping out a bunch of people is a good thing.
Yeah, sure.
It's a bad thing. And, the only good that can come of it is how we respond as humans.
You kind of touched upon on this right at the top of this chat. For liberty-minded folks, there's always this thought of, okay, where do we draw the line in the sand and say, like, I'm not going along with this anymore? And you mentioned by maybe May 1st, people are going to say, I've got to get back to work. Where is the sensible place to draw that line? And do you see that coming shortly?
Well, it's, if states can't get unemployment cash into people's hands because either their systems are broken down or they literally don't have the money. And if the feds, who have just been unbelievably inept with getting, what was this, $1,200 or whatever? I don't think anyone's gotten it yet.
No.
That's a piddling amount of money. And so that's, I think these things are going to be pretty immediate. I don't know how long people are just going to be able to get what they need from the grocery too, because for the moment that seems to be pretty good. But if you look at supply lines and distribution, and you go back enough steps, at some point, if people aren't going to work because they're not getting paid or they don't have the money to pay or whatever, then that starts to break down as well. So I think Americans will demand at least, working groceries and gas stations more than they will demand, zero additional COVID deaths.
Yeah.
So if we get to the point where gas stations and groceries are breaking down, that might be the point. And, I think your local gas station probably has maybe a week's worth in the tanks underneath. And grocery stores, I think, have about 3 days. So, this is the world we live in. It's wonderful that we get such a variety of cheap products, but it also has a just-in-time element that is being severely effed with right now by these lockdowns. And, I think May 1 sounds like a good time for some Irish democracy.
I got a few more, and these are more a little bit off topic, but it's fun because I have you on here. You worked very closely with Ron Paul over the years. I know that you know him and his family and everything. Over the years, we've heard this comparison between Ron and Bernie Sanders, that maybe it's just because they've always been outliers from their establishment, the wings of their respective parties. And the comparison drives me crazy. It always has. Because I can see surface level why it's there, but any step below the surface, in my opinion, there is no comparison. Could you give your thoughts on that and contrast Ron Paul with Bernie Sanders?
Well, there's actually an article today written by Walter Block on newrockwell.com about the Bernie he knew in high school.
Yes.
Because they went to high school together in Brooklyn.
That's right.
And so that was interesting. And by Walter's account anyway, Bernie Sanders is legitimately an intelligent guy. But there the comparison ends, because let's not forget this. Bernie Sanders was almost literally a bum. Up until about age 30, he sort of skulked around and lived in some communes where he didn't do a very good job pulling his weight, washing the dishes or whatever. I mean, this guy, before he became mayor of whatever town he became mayor of in Vermont, I mean, he was almost literally a bum, a guy who never really had jobs or anything. And so then he managed, probably through intelligence and skill, to, work his way from mayor into a member of the U.S. House, and then ultimately a senator, and then three-time presidential candidate. Let me just remind you that Ron Paul delivered 4,000 babies, and he drove all over South Texas, sometimes at 3 a.m, before cell phones, by the way, because sometimes babies come at strange times, and sometimes babies, he had a huge area to cover because there weren't very many OBs between Houston and San Antonio back then. It was just kind of a lot of nothing out there. And so, 4,000 babies is anybody who's ever, all the ladies in the audience who've given birth, how rough it is once. So, that's quite a different career path. So I like politicians who did things outside of politics. That's why I think Thomas Massey is so interesting.
Yes.
Some of your listeners might know there's a really cool free documentary on Amazon Prime.
Yes.
I guess you got to have Amazon Prime or whatever, but it's called Off the Grid, I believe.
Yeah.
That's about him. And so this was a guy who was really brilliant and really accomplished, and actually made a bunch of money by selling his tech company, and became financially comfortable at a young age prior to ever getting into even local politics. And he's very brilliant in terms of he's a tech guy. He worked in the virtual reality field when that was much younger, but he's also really involved on his property with all kinds of land use and all, solar and being self-sustaining. And he's really a brilliant and fascinating guy. And most people in Congress, Bernie Sanders included, are just nothing like that. I mean, they're basically Karens on steroids. They are, if you've seen the movie Election with Tracy Flick, they're the Tracy Flicks of the world. They sort of hung around in their town and went to those boring meetings on a Tuesday night where, they did make zoning decisions or something. You do that for long enough, and then you become a state rep, let's say. And then you get a little bit of name ID, and somebody retires, and you jump at the chance to become a U.S. rep. And before you know it, people are thinking you're smart and know something about anything, and you don't. You don't. There are people on all kinds of committees in Congress, and the committees are very much ranked in terms of their power and prestige. And the way you get on a powerful and prestigious committee, well, one is to be in Congress for a while, but two is to give a lot of money to the party above and use your campaign money that you raise to make donations to the party. That's how you really secure your spot on a good committee. And so there are people on, the banking committee, for example, now called Financial Services, who know nothing about banking. You could arguably say that Maxine Waters, the chair of the Financial Services Committee, knows nothing about banking. I mean, she's just someone who hung out in Washington for a long time, which is what Bernie is. They are the biggest bunch of nobody mediocrities you ever met in your life. And, that's so when you do get somebody who's got some achievement apart from what you want is somebody who the congressional salary is the least they've made in a long time, right? But instead, for most of them, it's the most they've ever made.
That's an interesting way to put it. Also, you guys over there at the Mises Institute and your podcast in particular, you've been doing a work on Human Action, a several-part series going through that book. And full disclosure, it's helping me get through that book. And I like you noted early on, in kind of bizarre times like this, getting back to your roots or reading the classics is a better way to spend your time, if you've got the time now, than surfing around on Facebook and seeing posts like I referenced earlier. Talk about that, what you guys are doing on the breaking down of Human Action and each podcast and how that's working.
Well, it's a great book, but it's a tough book. It's 900 some pages, and people ought to read it. Lay people ought to read it. And so a couple of years ago, I sort of took a different path with the podcast that was really aimed at books and going through books by Mises, books by Menger, Hayek, Rothbard, etc. And so we've gotten through many, many books. And at some point, we always knew we were going to do the Human Action series. And I say series because it's just such a big book. You got to break it up into multiple podcasts. And so that's been fun walking through the book. And I've noticed that, if you read, for example, chapter 20 of Human Action, which lays out basically the parameters of a business cycle and inflation and credit, 50 odd pages, you'll know more about business cycles than virtually any economist you meet. So, you can spend time reading current events, and there's a lot of FinTwit out there, a lot of Twitter people writing articles about what the Fed is doing and what the Treasury is doing. And you got to, well, at least for me anyway, yes, I need to know sort of mechanically what is happening legislatively and at the Fed. But really, if you want to understand things, you're far better off spending your time reading, let's say, Mises' Theory of Money and Credit, which came out in 1912, over 100 years old now. I mean, that book will do you more good than reading FinTwit articles. So some people, we started the series before the coronavirus and the shutdown, so we didn't know that was going to happen. But, some people have more time as a result of the shutdown, and we're getting some good feedback and people are enjoying it. And it's not for everybody. It's an acquired taste for a lay person to read economics. And I understand that not everybody is going to or wants to do that. And I think that's fine. But, the Mises Institute has always catered to people, lay people who do want to do that, who want to educate themselves and not be as vulnerable to the economic BS out there or the political BS out there. And so, we don't shy away from doing a podcast that's a little narrower and deeper, that maybe as opposed to just trying to get clicks.
Well, then plug away at what any spot online where my readers can find your writing and the Mises Institute in general.
Well, you can follow me on Twitter at Jeff Deist. You can follow the Mises Institute. Obviously, Mises.org is our site, and it's got a lifetime's worth of stuff. And the Human Action podcast is kind of my pet project, and that's available at iTunes and Stitcher and SoundCloud and YouTube, and also as a downloadable MP file on our site. And you don't have to read Human Action. You can just listen to the podcast if you want. If you want to take the shortcut, but really a magnificent book. And, there's so much short-term thinking in our society, and it's not just political and it's not just economic, it's cultural. It's deeper than that. And it's all a response to, what we think of conceptually as a high time preference society, people who want to live today at the expense of tomorrow, because that's actually rational in a lot of ways when money and credit is so cheap. When you're punished for saving money, for example. And so there needs to be people out there who are doing the work of reading tougher stuff and thinking about deeper things, and not just spending the shutdown watching the Tiger Guy or whatever. There's nothing wrong with either one, but we're here for the former. And we hope that we're doing them a service, and we hope that as tough of a job as it is, that we are growing on a per capita basis interest in the Austrian school and what you and I would consider a sensible political outlook, and then go from there. And the alternative, of course, is to do nothing. And I'm one of those people that maybe 5 years ago, but certainly 10 years ago, I understood and probably accepted the argument, like just go about your life and don't worry too much about government because you can't change it, and just worry about your family and your own finances. Get as wealthy as you can. Keep your head down. Ignore all this, but the pace of things has intensified, and now I think nobody can hide from this. If this won't even be like the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, people with money and without debt were able to buy up assets on the cheap, of course. So a lot of people came out of the Depression much wealthier than they went in. I'm not so sure that that's going to happen this time around, because I think that government is not going to just allow it. I think there are going to be wealth taxes. In other words, not sales taxes, not income taxes, not capital gains taxes when you buy and sell things, but just a balance sheet tax on you're just sitting there, and at the end of the year you have X net worth. You capitalist pig. You got to pay some of that for the good of the people. So I'm not so sure that any of us now can afford to ignore what's happening with central banks and with government. I wish we could. Believe me. Mm-hmm. I wish we could. I wish I could tell people to lead just a non-political life and don't worry about this stuff. You'd be better off, making your business better or working on your career. But now things have gotten so spooky that I think everyone has to pay attention.
Well put. Well said, Jeff. Thank you so much once again for being here on Death to Tyrants.
All right. I enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. All right. I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. Jeff is so cool. He's got this like hardcore radical vibe, and he mixes it perfectly with like a brilliant scholar and president of the Mises Institute. How cool is that? This has been episode 100. As you guys know, you can find me online, facebook.com/Death to Tyrants podcast. If you're going to join the Libertarian Party, we got a link for you, www.lp.org/Death to Tyrants. Let's see, I've got a Patreon account if you want to support the show, patreon.com/Death to Tyrants. And you can follow me on Twitter @BuckRebel, BuckRebel. As always, I will put a link in the show notes page to all of the stuff we talked about with Jeff. Thank you guys for the support. I'm so humbled and happy to do this, and I look forward to doing hundreds and hundreds of more. You guys have a great week.
You get split in fucking half, but I call the hologram wrath. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Death to Tyrants podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.